So I'm going to talk more about the Constitution, of course. This is our continuing series of walking through the Constitution here. And last time I finished with Article 1, which was on the legislative branch or Congress. So today I'm going to start with, go through Article 2, which is on the executive branch or the presidency. So even though it's called the executive branch, most of what's in the Constitution deals with the presidency. Since the president is the head of the executive branch of government. So, Section 1, again, these are broken down, and just like they are in Article 1, you got sections and then you got clauses after that. So that's what when I refer to sections and clauses, it's in Article 2. So, Section 1, Clause 1 is where the president and vice president are elected for 4-year terms. Now, initially there was no term limits in the Constitution. The 22nd Amendment, which was ratified in 1951 after FDR won 4 elections, that's when the term limits came in. But before that, there wasn't any. So presidents, if they wanted to, could serve more than 2 terms. But they basically honored the tradition that George Washington started, where he quit after 2 terms. He actually really wanted to quit after the first term, but he got talked into staying for another term. But he started a tradition, and the presidents who won 2 elections could they did the same thing where they stepped away after 2 terms. So there wasn't any term limits initially. So under the 22nd Amendment, you could actually, if you're like start out as the vice president, and then something happens to the president. So let's say 2 years in, the president dies. Okay, the vice president would serve the remaining 2 years of that term, and then they could run 2 more times. So they could actually serve up to 10 years if they were reelected twice. So you can theoretically at least serve more than 8 years, actually, if you start out as the vice president and then take over as president at some point. But so now we have the 2-year or 2-term limit, so you got an 8-year total, and as Trump is trying to do, it's not 8 consecutive years. I mean, you can run, serve 4 years, lose, and then win again at some point. So there's been Grover Cleveland did that back in our history in the 80s or 90s, back in that time frame. So it has happened. So that's Clause 1 of Section 1. Sets the 2 term limits of 4 years each. Clause 2 is about the Electoral College, which this is the entity that actually votes for the president. Now, it's kind of based on how the votes are counted from the state level, but this is the entity that actually votes for the president. Right? And the Electoral College only covers the presidential election, so sometimes people think it covers other things. No, it doesn't. It's just the presidential election. So right now, each state gets the number of House members that they have in the House of Representatives at the federal level, and 2 senators. Every state has 2 senators. So you add those 2 numbers together, that's how many electors that each state gets in the Electoral College. So Minnesota has 10 because we have 8 representatives, at least at this point we do. We've come close to losing one, but we still have 8 in the House. We have, of course, 2 in the Senate, so we have a total of 10 electors. So California leads the country. They have 55. And then Texas is next with 38. No surprise there, though. They're basically the 2 biggest states. And then New York and Florida each have 29 at this point. So they lead in the Electoral College. And then we have like North Dakota and South Dakota, and I think Montana and Maine and Wyoming, I believe. They have 3. So they have the smallest. So they have the 2 senators, and then they have 1 representative covers their whole state because of the population is so small. So they only have 3. So, but one other thing in Clause 2 is that if you are a federal officer, like if you are in the Senate or in the House or a federal judge or something like that, you cannot be an elector in the Electoral College. So these are, if you're somehow an officer of the federal government, you can't be there in the Electoral College. So Clause 3 now is, this is the long version, or the longest one probably in this article, where this is the process of the Electoral College and how it actually works. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details here, so I'm going to summarize it a little bit here, but it is kind of complicated, but here's the highlights at least. So initially, the Electoral College worked where, whoever got the most votes was the president, and whoever got the most votes, second most votes, was the vice president. Well, predictably, they ran into this, a problem with this in 1800, where Jefferson and Aaron Burr as vice president, of course, they got the same number of votes. So it got thrown to the House, and the House ended up picking Jefferson over Burr. So this process was modified by the 12th Amendment in the election of 1804, so that took care of that, where now the president and the vice president are separate ballots. So whoever gets the most for president gets president, and then, presumably their vice presidential person is going to, in a separate ballot, gets to be vice president. So right now, there are 538 Electoral College votes. So there's 435 people in the House. There's 100 people in the Senate. You add those, you get 535. And then Washington, D.C. gets 3 electoral votes. So on an earlier episode, I talked about how the federal government controls Washington, D.C. Well, they have given Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes. So that brings the total to 538. So you need 270 to win. That's the majority number. So that's why you hear all the people talking about how to get to 270. That's what they're talking about. So this year you need to get to 270 to win the Electoral College. If not, so let's say Harris and Trump run, neither of them gets to 270, then it goes to the House of Representatives, where each state gets 1 vote. And right now, the Republicans have more states in the House than the Democrats do. So if it goes there, the House of Representatives is likely to give it to Trump rather than Harris, even if Harris wins the popular vote. So this is why we got to get out and vote, right? We can't let this go to the House. So all you need in the House is a majority, of the states. So since the Republicans have more states, you know how they're going to vote. So that's, in a nutshell, the process in the Electoral College. There's a little bit more in Clause 4, which sets the time for the elections of the members of the Electoral College. So the Constitution gives that power to Congress to set, and Congress has set the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, every 4 years, every year we vote for the president, to choose the members. So each state has their own elections for the Electoral College members. However, the state law says it's done. Then the Electoral College members vote on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. So, after the election results are in, hopefully, the Electoral College members then vote. And then on January 6th is when the results are supposed to be certified. So this is why in January 6th of 2021, the insurrection happened, because they were trying to stop the Congress from certifying the results of the Electoral College. So that's kind of how it's set up for voting. So there's been people talking about, well, let's get rid of the Electoral College. This doesn't make sense. The loser of the popular vote can actually be the president, and why is it set up by states when shouldn't it just be majority? Whoever gets the most votes nationally wins. Well, if you wanted to do that way, you got to amend the Constitution, which I'll talk about in a later show. But that's hard to do because you need 3/4 of the states to ratify that proposed amendment, and right now that isn't going to happen. So what's going on is an interstate compact, where and these are typically the Democratic states, join together, they pass laws in their state legislature saying we are going to change our Electoral College system where, normally it's whoever wins the majority in that state gets those Electoral College votes. So the proposal is to change that to whoever wins the most votes nationally gets all of the Electoral College votes from that state. So there's an interstate compact going around to try and get to that 270 votes. So if let's just assume that they did this, somebody will sue, it'll go to the Supreme Court, and if the current Supreme Court is around or, something similar to it, I wouldn't count on the Supreme Court allowing this to happen. But it's something that's being done. So I did check this the other day, and right now they're up to 209 votes. So they still got a little ways to go to 270. Minnesota is one of those states who has done this, by the way. So there's been 17 states so far, and the District of Columbia has done it too. So we'll see how that turns out. But I suspect that'll go to the Supreme Court, and they'll have to make some decision on that. So moving on to Clause 5, this is the very few qualifications to be president. There are 3: a natural-born citizen, 35 years old, and 14 years a resident of the United States. So if I wanted to, I could run for president. So you'll see, when you vote in 2024 here, there's going to be a lot of people running for president that you never heard of. That's because it takes very few qualifications to run for president. So notice there's nothing in there about, experience. So this is how, Trump was able to run and win, because he satisfied those requirements. So there's been some talk about, well, we should make have some cognitive tests and all that sort of thing. But again, you'd have to amend the Constitution probably to do that. So I don't think that's going to happen either. So Clause 6 is where the vice president takes over if something happens to the president, so he can't do the job. And the 25th Amendment kind of comes into play here, where if the vice president takes over, then Congress elects a new vice president to take place of the vice president moving up to the president. Now, a president can temporarily step down for some reasons, and this happens fairly frequently, where they, if they have some medical procedure that they do, for example, that's one of the more common ones. They turn the power over to the vice president for a short period of time, and then when they're better, they take over again. So that happens periodically. The 25th Amendment, however, adds something to this, where they allow if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet believes that the president can't carry out his or her duties, then they got to notify Congress. So there was some talk about Trump during his presidency of this happening, but it never did. But if it did happen, if Congress is notified by the vice president and the majority of the cabinet, then the vice president takes over. And then the president can later say, well, I'm better now, so I'm going to come back. And if the vice president and the cabinet agree with that, well, then he's back in power. But if they don't, then 2/3 of Congress has to vote within 3 weeks period of time to basically who's the president going to be. So, there was talk of that with Trump, but that's never happened as far as I can recall in our system. But that's what the 25th Amendment. When you talk about the 25th Amendment, that's what they're talking about. So Clause 7 is about the president's salary, which is currently $400,000. Plus, they have some various expense accounts with $169,000 total up in there. Now, I suspect there's other ways they can get money too, but that's the basics. So the presidents aren't really doing this to make money. It's the power thing why they're doing this, but that's what they get paid right now. And then finally, Clause 8 is the oath of office that they take at the inauguration on January 20th. So if Harris wins, and let's hope she does, she's going to take an oath of office that is written in the Constitution on January 20th. So that's the end of Section 1 for Article 2 on the presidency. So we'll continue on with that next week.